Good morning, Sweetwater Church. How are you? Let's all stand up and get ready to worship our Lord this morning. I'd also like to give a huge welcome to those who will be watching online and who are watching online as well. All right. Let's worship our God. You give life, you give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord, it's your breath, it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Oh, let's sing again. You give life, you give life, you are love, bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. And great are you, Lord. Sing out, it's your breath, it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you. Oh, it's your breath, it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, we pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you. All the earth, and all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth, and all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath, it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you. Oh, it's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise, pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Oh, great are you, Lord. Sing your praises. Great are you, Lord. Let's continue to worship our God. Turn your ear to heaven and hear the noise inside, the sound of angels, all the sound of angel songs, and all this for a king. We could join and sing. this song of ours will rise. Oh, how constant, how divine. This love of ours will rise. Will rise. Sing, oh, praise Him. Oh, praise Him. Sing loud. Oh, praise Him. He is holy. He is holy. Turn your gaze to heaven and raise a joyous noise. The sound of salvation come, the sound of rescue ones, and all is for a king. Angels join to sing, all for Christ the King. How infinite and sweet, this love so rescuing. Oh, how infinitely sweet, this great love that has redeemed. As one we sing, oh, praise Him, oh, praise, oh, praise Him. He is holy, He is holy. Sing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. He is holy, you are holy. He is holy. Oh, praise, oh, praise Him, oh, praise, oh, praise Him. He is holy, He is holy. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. He is holy, He is holy. Turn your ear to heaven and hear the noise inside. Sing the sound of angels are the sound of angels' songs, and all this for a king. We could join and sing all to who? All to Christ the King. Amen, amen. Thank you, Lord.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? If you're watching online, I'm Pastor Chris. I'm the lead pastor here, and I've been gone the last couple Sundays on vacation, and it was a wonderful trip. And Sharon Hatch and her husband came back from the same area, so we're going to have a little talk at some point about this. But it was fabulous. Just came away so refreshed. And some of you already know, but my husband and I think you guys know that we. Most of you know, at least, that my oldest son was, he and his wife were expecting their first baby. It was a little boy, and I begged her to have him before, because she went into labor yesterday before 10, and at 9:56, our grandson was born, and we got to watch the wonders of technology. And her mom was in the labor and delivery room with her, and so she put her on FaceTime, and we got to watch him be born. And he's got big old fat cheeks, and he's a chubby little guy, and so Ken and I are super excited. So anyway, that's all about me. So I just had to share some joy this morning. And then I am doing announcements. We have a VBS coming up for children 3 and up. If you know anyone that is interested, if you have nieces and nephews, grandkids, please sign up. We would love to have them here and participating. And then we also have a water day. We have a lot of kids' activities this summer, and so we also have a water day and a horse day. And the horse day is going to be my favorite personally because we get to go to the Rose's house, and I think Patty Usher's horse is going to be there too. Your new one, right? And so if you want your kids to be able to just have some interactions with horses, or if you want to come as an adult and have some interactions, you are more than welcome to. And there's information in the flyer. They're posted throughout. They're also online and on our Sweetwater Church app. So we'd love for you to participate in that. And then in August, we are doing an all-church picnic. We're going to have an outdoor service here, and we're going to hopefully, possibly do some baptisms that day that will be outdoors. So please mark that on your calendar, and we would love to have you. So I get to introduce some of my favorite people. They were a little sassy this morning during practice. So I can't wait to hear them. But these are the Merry Ukes. Some of you have heard them before, and they're just so much fun. And you guys bring so much joy and laughter and just enthusiasm, and we just love having you guys here, and we just thank you for giving up part of your day to come and bless us with your music. So Eloise is, I think you're the uke leader, today. Sort of, today. So will you guys help me in giving them a warm welcome, and we're just so excited to have you guys here.
Thank you for inviting us back to celebrate this special day in our history. There are fewer of us today due to illness, so we're really relying on you to help us sing our songs. There are many patriotic songs written to commemorate this day. Our first song was originally a poem written by Catherine Bates in 1893, and it was made into a song in 1910. Please join us in America the Beautiful. Oh, beautiful fortress, spacious skies, forever waves of rain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, our shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for patriot that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities on him by human tears. America, God shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. I'm sure many of you recognize our next two songs, composed by George M. Cohan. James Cagney made them famous in his film Yankee Doodle Dandy in 1942. You're a grand old flag, you're a high-flying flag, and forever and peace may you reign. You're the emblem of the land I love, the home of the free and the brave. Every heart beats true, beneath the red, white, and blue, where there's never a post or brave. Here's a quotation from Billy Graham that I found in an old hymnal, the yellow one, about the social obligations of a Christian. The Bible teaches that the Christian should be law-abiding. The Bible also teaches loyalty to country. A loyalty and love of country does not mean that we cannot criticize certain unjust laws that may discriminate against special groups. The Bible says that God is no respecter of persons. All should have equal opportunities. The government of God is to be our model. The Bible also teaches that we are to cooperate with the government. But to be simply law-abiding is not enough. We ought to seek and work for the good of our country. Sometimes we may be called upon to die for it. We are to do it gladly as unto God. We are to be conscientious in our work as good citizens. Let's sing 2 verses of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Our final song has really become our second national anthem, so you probably want to stand when we get to that. But as a prelude, Lou Spill and I will sing a verse of Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA, and then join us when we sing God Bless America. You ready?
Okay.
G? If tomorrow all these things were gone, we'd worked for all our lives, and we had to start again with our husbands, kids, and wives. I thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free, and I won't forget the men who died who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies to the ocean, where we fall. God bless America, my home sweet home. God bless America, my home Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. You got us into the Independence Day spirit for sure. Did you hear what he said? He said, we didn't mess it up. He said, it was good, Eloise. I love it. I love it. Oh, my goodness. Well, I just want to take a moment to thank them again, the Mary Utes. You always bless us and make us smile and bring joy to the house of the Lord. But also, today, it says kids are dismissed, but they're not. Kids are staying in service today. Andrew, his daughter, continues to test positive for COVID, so he is staying home with her. And at least, wait, actually, I take that back. Is Deanna in here? Were you supposed to go today? We don't know. Esther, do you want childcare? You're good? Okay, we're staying in. I love that we're still a small enough church that we can just be real and put it out there. I'm sure other churches would say that's not professional, but I love our church and I love you guys. But I just want to introduce to you, I think most of you know him. The last time he was up here, he was still on crutches and actually a wheelchair. Oh my gosh. But this time he's coming up not to give a testimony, but my husband, many of you know, he served in the military. He was in the Navy ROTC at UC Berkeley, and he did active duty for about 8.5 years and then did 13 years of reserve. So he's retired from the military, and you combine that with he has a history degree and he has a passion for history. I don't get it personally, but I have to say I've listened to him teach in his classroom, and he's actually an incredible teacher, and I probably would have loved history a whole lot more had I had my husband. And, you know, if you guys know me, I adore him, but I don't normally like go woohoo, but my husband is an incredibly gifted teacher. I would have never told you that he would ever in his life, though, teach junior high kids as long as he has. And he loves history. He loves speaking the truth of it. And so I've asked him if he would share today and just give kind of a historical perspective of the beginnings of our country and with Christianity weaved in, and I've just asked him to kind of give an overview. So if you guys would mind welcoming my husband, Ken, and he's going to share.
All right, good morning, everyone. It is hard to follow the Mary Ukes. From upbeat to a history lesson. I don't know about this. So as Chris said, she asked me to present a little bit about kind of the history of Christianity and how it's kind of threaded through the timeline. So this is going to be a lot of information in a very, very short amount of time. So I tried to compact it, but I told her I can really shrink it, or I can go long if she needs me to go long. So the one thing I would say, kind of as a caveat at the beginning, is it's kind of like inviting non-Christians to the dinner table. You got to be careful of your dinner table conversations. If you get historians in the room, or at least people that like history, they're not likely to agree on what the founders believed, what they didn't believe, and the exact nature of their faith. So I am not speaking authoritatively on any of these topics, but you will recognize a lot of it is you're going to go back to 8th grade or 11th grade and say, I remember that, or I already know this story. So if I'm adding something to it, or it's not the way you remembered it, I'm just one voice. It's just one man's interpretation. So in terms of Christianity in America, remember the colonists came from England, and it wouldn't have happened. Protestant Christianity wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a break in the Catholic Church. So following Martin Luther and the Reformation, decade and a half later, King Henry VIII, the man of 6 wives, breaks off the Church of England and the Anglican Church. And I think if you remember way back, because of not his wife, Catherine of Aragon, not being able to produce a male heir. So we go wife, 6 wives later. You know, that's the story of England, and the Anglican Church is basically born. And it's very similar in its structure to the Catholic Church. That the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is rooted in the hierarchy and the structure. But when we get to the story of the Pilgrims and the Puritans and others that come to America, it looks less and less and less like the Anglican Church and the Church of England. So I put up the picture there of, how Christian were the founding fathers. It depends on how you ask. And I'm going to go through a couple of them individually. Some of them were very clearly men of faith, some God believers, but Jesus and the Trinity is a whole another game for some of the founders. Oop, I need to turn it on. This has range. Better range than my classroom. So if you can remember back this far, the colonies were established south, north, middle. So South New England and in the middle colonies. And I listed them up there, Jamestown, Plymouth, and Salem. The original colonists did not come for religious freedom. The colonists that settled in Jamestown came for economic reasons, and it was a for-profit colony that basically failed. The colonies that came later up in New England, especially in Massachusetts, those are the colonies where if you want to trace back, spiritual growth and Christianity, it's Massachusetts and it's Plymouth and it is Salem. There are other reasons why colonists came, and I put them up there. Some just wanted a new start. Some came as indentured servants, and of course some came against their will as slaves to Virginia beginning in 1619. But to focus on the religious aspect in the most religious colony, it is definitely Massachusetts. So that's where you get your Pilgrims and your Puritans. They are often confused. They're often viewed as the one and the same, and they are not. They are not. The Pilgrims who came and landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, they were separatists. They wanted to completely break free from the Church of England, basically establish a new church in America. And when you look at the ship's company in the Mayflower, not every pilgrim, a pilgrim is someone who makes a journey, particularly a religious journey, but not all the people on the Pilgrim came for religious freedom. Half the crew were just others, sailors, crew members, and whatnot. And those 51 religious passengers, the true pilgrims, a lot of them didn't make it. Like 90% of the pilgrims died within the first year because there was a freezing period, a starving time, and they almost didn't make it. The Puritans, on the other hand, came in mass. They came 10 years later. No pun intended. They came in mass to Massachusetts. They came about 1,000, and they were reformers. Rather than trying to completely separate or break free of the Church of England, they were trying to purify it from within. Basically, remove what's left of the Catholic remnants and create a better, pure Church of England here in America. They're the ones, though, that are going to be the most hypocritical, because the Pilgrims and Puritans both came for religious freedom, but when you look at how they behaved and how they treated others, the Puritans became very intolerant, very, very intolerant compared to the Pilgrims in Plymouth. And I put the little Pac-Man symbol up there because in the long haul, the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is the Puritan colony, absorbs the Pilgrims, absorbs Plymouth. And Massachusetts, the colony, and then the state that it becomes, is largely Puritan influenced and much less so Pilgrim influenced. And I just kind of put up a couple of notes up there. The Pilgrims, when I would teach U.S. history, are important not just because of the religious journey that they embarked upon, but because when they landed, even though it was male only, no women included, they did establish essentially the first self-government. They signed a compact called the Mayflower Compact, and they set the stage for self-government in America because they didn't land where they were supposed to. They were outside the king's jurisdiction, and they basically got away with doing what they wanted to do without being micromanaged. In the long run, that's going to pave the way for the revolution, because as I always told my students, if you're a child growing up in a home and your parents have rules, but they never enforce them, and then one day, 1 month, 1 year later, they enforce a rule that you've been breaking forever, you're going to wonder why. And that's kind of the story of the colonies. They were rule breakers the entire time, but it was only when the rules really got enforced that you had the pushback. So self-government in the Pilgrims, so kind of the democratic origins are there. The Puritans, on the other hand, is a theocracy. John Winthrop was not only their governor, but he was also the religious leader. So when we get later to Jefferson and talk of separation of church and state, that's because of the Puritans. John Winthrop had absolute power. The Puritans became very intolerant. It is because of their influence in Massachusetts that basically the other New England, the Massachusetts fractures, they start banishing and kicking people out like Anne Hutchinson and for who would I put up there? Oh, and Roger Williams. They basically form Rhode Island because they're kicked out of Massachusetts because they're not rule followers. Anne Hutchinson was essentially kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony because she was teaching a Bible study in her home. It would be like Chris being kicked out, excommunicated, or kicked out for being a female minister. But that was Anne Hutchinson. She's the first, really, historically, an American woman to be given the boot because she dared to preach and teach men in her to be men in her home. Or taught men in her home, not to be men. But so the Puritans as a theocracy, that's is going to lay the groundwork for later what ends up in the First Amendment and what role do we really want religion to have in civic life, in public life, and in government life, and where should that line be? The Quakers are going to come next. They settled in Pennsylvania, and when Chris was looking at my slides, he said, "That's really the Quaker guys?" Yes, that's really William Penn. Yeah. That's William Penn. That's the caricature of William Penn on the Quaker Oats thing. The Quakers arrived actually in Massachusetts. They kind of migrated to New Jersey, like a lot of religious groups, because of the Puritans. They faced a lot of persecution. I would like to think they're the ones that we most would want to be like or emulate. They were the most tolerant, the most anti-slavery at the time, the most for indigenous people's rights, for women's rights, you name it, and the Quakers were for it, which made them outliers at the time. William Penn is fortunate in that his family is owed a debt by the king at the time, and that debt is paid in the form of land. Penn's land, Pennsylvania. So that's when the Quakers eventually migrated to Pennsylvania, and it became a mega colony for the Quakers. Philadelphia, the city of the brotherly love. I don't know if it's so much anymore, but that's how it began. By the way, this is a complete sidebar, but the Quaker, if you look at the history of Quaker Oats and the label itself, they've thinned them out. About 5 years ago, if you can find an old label, if you Google it, William Penn's features, he had a chubbier face, a rosier cheeks, and kind of looked a little bit heavier set. But Quaker wanted to change the image that Quaker Oats were much more healthy for you. So they did a very subtle thinning of William Penn and the Quaker Oats guy to make it more appealing that this is really good for you, that it's really good for you. Here's the other outlier colony, Maryland. Maryland was essentially established as a refuge for Catholics. So remember, after the Reformation, and especially after Elizabeth, remember Elizabeth's half-sister is Mary, the Catholic. Elizabeth is Protestant. So when the Protestants come to power under Elizabeth, the Catholics become the persecuted group in England for the most part, and they are looking for a safe haven in America. That place becomes Maryland, but it's not named after Queen Mary, the Bloody Mary that was wreaking havoc against Protestants in England, but it's easy to think that. But Maryland was essentially the first colony to establish a statute that granted freedom of religion. So when you look at what happens in Virginia and then in the Constitution, the first freedom of religion law is that statute is written in Maryland to protect. The goal is to protect Catholics, but it covers everyone. It covers everyone who's living in Maryland at the time. Next, spiritually, and this is kind of will connect more to the present. There are two great awakening periods both in the 1700s and again in the 1800s, which are huge evangelistic revival periods. It's also the connection to the church we're in right now, the Wesleyan Church. So that's John Wesley up there. He is acquaintances with a man named Jonathan Edwards. He is a friend of George Whitefield, who are traveling itinerant ministers who are basically praising fire, are basically doing fire and brimstone sermons throughout the colonies. It is a period of great revival, of spiritual revival, a lot of conversions, and not just out of fear. There's some fear-based things going on there, but Wesley is a contemporary of both Whitefield and of Edwards, and as Chris used this when we were doing was it when she talked about being influencers and that everyone has the power or the ability to be an influencer even when you don't recognize it. And those are your three big early evangelistic influencers: Edwards, Wesley, and Whitfield. The key to, if you're looking at it from a not just a spiritual but a democratic type of perspective, is that in church for the first time what the colonists were hearing was not only a passionate salvation sermon, so to speak, but they were being told for the first time that spiritual equality and political equality are one and the same. That you are not only equal in God's eyes spiritually, but you're equally to each other politically. And in the long run, what it means for the colonists leading up to the revolution, and that it's kind of that they're hearing from their preachers that it's okay to question authority. Ultimately, it's okay to question the king, and it'll be okay to question King George. So though the dominant message of the Great Awakening is one of spiritual revival and salvation, they're now being encouraged almost from the pulpit that you can question authority. And that's huge when it comes to what's going to happen down the road in the revolution. At the time, and this is where I'm kind of on shaky ground because I don't fully understand deism to give you a lecture on it. But if you look at Christians in the colonial period, they're either identifying as Protestants in one of these denominations or those whom are closely identify as being deist. And the easiest way to, I guess, explain it is that deists believe in God, believe in a creator, but the whole Jesus and the Trinity and the supernatural powers, not so much. And I put some of the names that are the more famous founding fathers on both sides because it's unclear exactly where they lay. And it's an argument among historians that are a heck of a lot smarter than me. But deists are influenced by the period of the Enlightenment, of a more rational, humanistic look at the world and at religion. Whereas those who identify Protestant clearly have a different mindset and a different spiritual outlook in terms of God that includes Jesus, not just that there's a God, the creator, but Jesus in their lives. And I said, so it's hard to peg some of these founders exactly where they are because they can kind of go back and forth. So if you look at a couple of them, George Washington, definitely a spiritual man, definitely a man of God. Some of the most famous images of him, like at Valley Forge during the Revolution, of him praying. He added, when a president takes the oath of office, there's a specific line, just like when I got sworn and commissioned in the Navy, you have to recite it verbatim. Without being asked or told or without indicating what he was going to do, he added, "So help me God," to the end of his oath of office when he became president. Every president has recited that since then. So even though it's not required, it is almost embedded now in our political tradition, even though it's not required. Kind of in the same way, I think, if you ever get called to a witness stand, you take the oath. You don't have to add the last part, but I think most do, and George Washington did. I couldn't find a specific example, for example, of him taking communion, and that I couldn't find that in the evidence. But in terms of prayer, and I said he mentions God so many times. Where he lies, I think he lies closer to being a Protestant and an Episcopalian than he does being a deist. But some historians will group him in that category. Jefferson. Ooh. I really like Thomas Jefferson, but his where he comes down the line religiously, he's going to make you go, oh, maybe he's not the guy I thought he was. He's definitely on the spectrum on the deist side. Believes in God. Believes, in the opening paragraph to the Declaration of Independence, he mentions the Creator, the laws of nature, the divine providence. He is clearly a believer in a supreme being and a God, but he's not, and he believes in the teachings and practices of Jesus, but none of the miracles, basically. There's a book, the Jefferson Bible, which is Thomas Jefferson's personally edited New Testament, which removes all the things that we believe to be true and limits it just to the to the lessons, just the human lessons. So Jefferson is an important founding father, but I wouldn't rank him high up on your list if you're looking as a leader in the Christian church. There is a very common misconception, even among adults and students, about the Constitution and the phrase separation of church and state. Do not let anyone ever tell you that is in the Constitution. They are wrong. They are lying to you. That is, I'll put up the part of the Constitution where it talks about religion, but that phrase, a separation of church and state, is taken from a speech that Jefferson gave to the Danbury Baptist Church. He was asked to speak at that church. And at the very end of that, he talks about building that he thought it was important to build a wall of separation between church and state, that there should be a clear separation of government and religion, and government shouldn't be interfering at all. And I think, going the other way. But that expression has been used by secular people and by lay people for 250 years as being in the Constitution, and that this physical wall actually exists when it doesn't. It exists in Jefferson's mind, and it exists as a way to view things, but that's not actually written into the Constitution. Oh, there. But what is written in the Constitution? So that's Madison. So Madison is the author of the Bill of Rights. He wrote 12, 10 got adopted. So the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. He's interesting. He's like a lot of these founding fathers. Their spirituality got stronger as they got older. You know what I mean? So the closer they got to death, I think they got a little bit more convicted later on. The First Amendment's so important because it protects it's freedom of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And as I would tell my students, the simplest way is no one can tell you what to believe, whether you want to be an atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Christian. It doesn't. The government has no say. The government has no say. But likewise, the government can't encourage or endorse one particular religion over another. That's the simplest way of looking at it. It doesn't mean that we don't have godly men and women who are leading the country, who can't be filmed or shown going to church services or doing anything spiritual or Christian or Muslim or whatever it is in nature. But they can't use their pedestal, they can't use their pulpit or forum to convince others. And that's the fine line. That it is a very fine line between being who you are and then doing it in a way that's trying to convince others that they should be the same. And I'll get to it in the classroom. It's a whole nother animal trying to negotiate and navigate that as a public school teacher. And I'll talk about, there's a couple of recent Supreme Court cases that involve the First Amendment. We don't really have too many First Amendment cases with religion, with speech all the time, but we've had a couple involving freedom of religion recently. Ben Franklin, but boy was he a player. Another product of the Enlightenment. At the beginning, he's also like a lot of he's more about morals and values, the teachings, but less about Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Trinity. But once again, the older he gets, the more divinely inspired he became, I think, a pretty outspoken Christian in support of not just God, but God in the form of the Trinity. So go Ben. Don't approve of all of his escapades in Europe, but go Ben Franklin. Presidents, every president has identified as being Christian in one form or another. 44 Protestant, 2 Catholic. Joe Biden and JFK, right? Joe Biden and JFK. So, there's no in fact, the Constitution prohibits a religious requirement, a religious test for public office, state or federal. But every president has identified whether they're really strong believers or just show up enough times to be recognized for being such. I don't know. I personally believe that we're still a long ways away from having a non-Christian being elected president. People say things, I always tell the students, people say things publicly, but then when they get in the privacy of their voting booth, they'll vote their conscience. They're not going to vote what people want them to hear or say. I mean, could it happen? Of course it could happen. But are we a Judeo-Christian nation? Our roots, are we still predominantly, we're still a majority Christian nation compared to other faiths. And I still think it would be very hard for a non-Christian to be elected. I think it would be an atheist, someone who is outright atheist, I think would be, I don't want to say nothing's impossible. That would be very difficult. But a person of another faith, that could happen. I don't know in our lifetimes, but that could happen. A woman will be elected president. I would always tell my students we are much closer to having a woman elected president than I think somebody from another, man or woman from another denomination. In terms of the next kind of religious thread I picked out in our history, the time period of westward expansion, Oregon Trail, California Trail, Santa Fe Trail, pioneers moving west, acquiring California, Texas, and the Western territories, that time period in history, kind of the historical term for it is manifest destiny, which is a very controversial term now in terms of cancel culture type of, if you have a cancel culture type of mentality. The spirit of the time, and this is why I always warn students and adults, it's hard. Don't tell me that if you were alive back then, you would have acted differently. You can say that you wish that you would have been a different person in 1840 or 1860, but you're not raised in today's culture. You would have been raised in that time period back then, so it's hard to literally time travel and say you would have been a different person because you don't know that. So I tell them it's hard not, be careful of judging their attitudes and their perspectives when you didn't live in that time period. You're viewing things through a paradigm of 2021 or 2022. But Manifest Destiny was a quote by a newspaper editor, and it basically encapsulated the idea that it was not only destined for Americans to cross the continent, to basically conquer from Atlantic to Pacific, to move on to the territory, to make it better, to make it grander, to make it one North American continent for the United States. That's part of it, but the other part of it was that they truly believed that God was paving the way for them, that God had blessed this was blessing their journey west, and that it didn't matter who was in the way, whether it was indigenous peoples, whether it was war with Mexico, whomever, it was justified. It was justified. Now, not all the pioneers were going west with that thinking that God said I could do it, so I'm gonna do it. But in the big picture, it was justified at the national level that America is this blessed nation, and in order to grow and to be who we were meant to be, what our destiny, it meant that more than a few obstacles were going to have to be not jumped over, but removed, to be honest, not to be jumped, but to actually be removed. So context matters a lot in terms of how you view it, because a lot of people look back at that. How did we actually do what we did? Was it morally right or wrong? What they did back then. Well, that is water under the. There's water under the bridge now. I mean, we are who we are right now, and we live in a totally different context. So when you look at, that's a very super famous painting that just shows kind of the angel moving westward across the continent with, God is blessing this. But it was a big motivator, a spiritual motivator for many pioneers to head west and not think bad about what they were doing in the process. That's not all of them, but it was the mindset of many. Other kind of just evangelical periods, I mentioned the First Great Awakening, which happens pre-revolution. Post-revolution, there is a Second Great Awakening, same type of movement, a revival movement, an evangelistic movement. It's where we get Methodist, the Baptist. It's emphasizing salvation. It's emphasizing it's a more passionate, emotional response to the church. And then that's followed up really more recently, post-World War II, Billy Graham to the kind of the modern day Christian right. So if you're looking at pure evangelism and dominant themes in American history, you've kind of got this pre-revolution period, you've got a post-revolutionary period, and then you got a big jump. You kind of got a 100-year jump before you have another big evangelistic period, and that's after World War II, and a lot of it is driven, by Billy Graham. Kind of bringing it to the present in terms of the Constitution and things I think that are obvious and maybe not so obvious, because I would always get asked, why is it legal to have "In God We Trust" on our money, right? Isn't that violating the Establishment Clause? Isn't government endorsing in God if it says "In God We Trust" on the money? Well, kind of, sort of, not really. Kind of, sort of, not really. It was officially adopted as our motto, our national motto in 1956. It's interesting, the Supreme Court has never, ever ruled directly on "In God We Trust" on the currency. But it has ruled indirectly by not letting certain cases advance to the Supreme Court. And essentially what the Supreme Court has said, whether it's been left-leaning or right-leaning, is that "In God We Trust" has enough historical meaning to it as part of our narrative over 250 years that it doesn't have a purely religious meaning the way it may have had at one time. So "In God We Trust" is safe. "In God We Trust" is safe. And what I think is interesting, 3 states actually have it as their state mottos, and you can see it on their license plates as well. California, clearly not one of them. The 10 Commandments. It's because the 10 Commandments is actually kind of in school curriculum, in the 6th grade curriculum, when they learn about the Israelites in that time period. The Supreme Court has ruled on a number of 10 Commandment cases. Basically, it can't, other than if it's in the curriculum, you cannot display the 10 Commandments in your classroom. So even as a history teacher, I could not have a static display, like a year-long display of the 10 Commandments in my room. But I could have it up if that's what I was teaching at the time. Does that kind of make sense? But I couldn't have it up as a constant thing. So that violates the Establishment Code, because then the feeling is you're trying to influence students beyond the curriculum, basically, or indoctrinate them. Government and state land, the Supreme Court has said yes, but not inside. So there are a lot of states or a lot of courthouses around the United States where you'll see monuments of the 10 Commandments displayed outside, but where you can't display them is physically inside the courthouse itself. So it's kind of a nuanced ruling for the Supreme Court, where it's allowed and then where we're not allowed. Private displays, you can put it on your front lawn, right? No one can do anything about that. In public parks, it's an interesting one. In public areas, they can be there until it's contested, and then once it's contested, generally they come down. Because what's happened in the past is once a public area allows one display, then they can't say no to other displays. So then you get the 10 Commandments here, and then you got a satanic statue here, because if this one's okay, then this one's okay. Does that make sense? So the 10 Commandments is kind of it kind of depends on the context. The pledge, the Pledge of Allegiance. So they said there's a long history to the pledge. The words have changed throughout the years. The way we recite it now. So we've added words to it. The "under God" part was added under the Eisenhower administration. I think a lot of it was added during the Red Scare, the Communist Scare, post World War II. The Supreme Court has basically said you can't force someone to recite it. You cannot force it. So it can't be compulsory. It depends on where, in public schools, it really depends on what school you're talking about. It is still recited often in elementary schools. In secondary schools, hardly ever. In the middle school both middle schools that I taught, the only time that we recited the Pledge of Allegiance was at assemblies. But there are some schools where they have an intercom system that goes classroom to classroom. I never had a school that had that. And in those schools, it's often recited via the intercom, and then students stand and recite the pledge. But what a teacher cannot do is make a student stand and recite it. So if a student wants to sit down or stand and just not mouth the words, they are free to do so. You can't intimidate them, bully them, shame them, or any of those things. It has to be completely voluntary. It can't be compulsory. So religion in the public schools, this, by the way, I updated one slide because it's going to change this slightly. There can be student clubs. Students can pray before a test. They can pray on their own. What they cannot do is a religious activity that actually interferes with instruction in the classroom. So if they're doing something silently or as a group that's on their own and it's not disruptive, they can do it. This is a lot more tricky, though, for students and for schools that have a higher population of Muslim students, for example, who pray on mats in a certain number of times a day. So it gets a little bit more challenging for schools and how they handle that. But in a public school where I did, if a student was praying and I was aware of it, they are free. They're free to do that. They can organize their own groups. They can go to the flagpole and pray as a student body. There are no restrictions on that. What a teacher cannot do, obviously, is organize it or lead it themselves. So that's the fine line. I can be as religious as I want, as Christian as I want, but what I can't do is use my position as an adult and as a teacher, as a state employee, as a public state employee, to try to influence students into believing what I believe. Now, what I'm not prohibited from doing, though, or what I shouldn't say, what teachers in public school, they can discuss if asked. So if a teacher is asked a direct question, if I would say, "Hey, Mr. Hughes, do you or do your family go to church? Do I have to? Can I say yes? Of course I can." But then where that conversation goes, I have to be a little bit more guarded. But I'm allowed, even in front of others. If one student asks, but it's in front of the class, I can answer. But I had to be very careful about how far I was willing to go. And it's a lot of the trust that you build with students over the course of the school year. The very first tattoo I got was this one on my wrist, and it was very intentional and strategic because I wanted to be able to hand out papers and do things, and I knew that it would be noticed. And if it was noticed, I would be asked, and then if I was asked, I could answer. Does that make sense? So I couldn't initiate conversations, but I could respond. I could respond and react. So I don't know if that's violating the spirit of the Constitution, but I bent the rules a little bit. So discussion, but no indoctrination, discussion. And some students are very perceptive just because of the way you conduct yourself, how you model yourself. They know. I mean, it's even middle school. They generally know where a teacher's at. Even if just like you can never tell them what political party you're in, because you don't want them telling their parents, and you think you're being prejudged, that you're not open-minded. And if anything, I was much more unbiased and neutral as a teacher than I ever am as in private. Because I just never wanted the students to think that they were being judged or that I wasn't listening to them, and that I could, through a filter, that I could just listen to them with an open heart and an open mind. There's a lot of religion in the curriculum. The 6th grade curriculum and the 7th grade curriculum, as a history teacher, they learn about Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, you name it, and it's covered. I mainly covered, when I was doing 7th grade, the Reformation and the breakup of the Catholic Church, and then in 8th grade, the Constitution. But so I didn't, I did have to teach Islam in 7th grade. But but it's always you're teaching, what do Muslims believe? What do Jews believe? What do Hindus believe? Not what do I believe. And it would be, I wasn't like, you should follow the 10 Commandments, but here are the 5 pillars of Islam. These are the ones you should, pay. No. You make them familiar with, and they need the content standards are very specific, but don't get caught trying to lead them into as if you're indoctrinating them. A couple this is I think the last one. A couple of interesting court cases that have come up recently. The one on the left. So 5 years ago, there was a public high school coach up in Bremerton, Washington, Everton, near one of the naval bases up in Washington, and he had made it his habit of once the game was concluded of going out to the 50-yard line, and he would take a knee and he would pray. Over the course of time, some of the players, both from his team and the other team, began to join him in this. He was then suspended and essentially fired for doing this. His case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and 2 weeks ago they ruled 6-3 in his favor, which is a significant. It's one of the first said there are not a lot of freedom of religion cases that make it to the court. They often get suppressed at the appellate court level or another level. But essentially, they ruled that what he was doing was not coercive. That him going to the 50-yard line, he wasn't like making the team go with him. It was an implied invitation, but not an explicit invitation. And because of that, the Supreme Court said he was basically wrongly terminated, and that public official teacher, basically a coach or a teacher, can be a little bit, by interpreting it, can be a little bit more transparent, but I still think it's a fine. I think you have to still have to be careful. So that was a huge one. The other one was in Boston. So outside Boston City Hall, they have 3 flagpoles. One for the city of Boston, one they had they had the state flag, the U.S. flag, and then they had another flagpole where different community groups could petition. There was an application process, and for a short period of time, never permanently, their flag could be raised. Whether it's the LGBTQ flag during Pride Month, or whether it's BLM flag, or whatever the community group happened to be, every single group and there was like over 200 groups, had their flag approved, and up the flagpole it went for a week or 2 weeks or a month, except for one. A Christian group filled out the application to have the Christian flag fly, and they were denied. So that case worked its way through the Supreme Court and actually made it through the court system relatively quickly. And the most interesting is not only did they approve it, it was 9-0. So not 6-3, or at the, like you might have thought, but 9-0, because it was clearly discriminatory that what City Hall was doing was discriminatory, because how can you say yes to every group but one, and that one group happened to be a Christian group. So they won the right to be able to fly their flag. I don't know when that's going to happen, but essentially that was in a way it's a freedom of religion court case, but it was more, when you look at it from a constitutional point of view, it's kind of more of a 14th Amendment in terms of discrimination. They were being discriminated against, but it was based on their religion. I think, yeah, that's all. That's all. Sorry, I exceeded my time. Oh, it's the cross with a fish intersected. That was the tattoo that I got. And it definitely opened up a lot of
Mike.
conversations.
This is a very careful one. Well, why don't you talk about it from the perspective that not the morality side, but as it relates to the Constitution. That even, remember you shared with me like the historical view even amongst lawyers prior to Roe versus Wade was that there isn't a guarantee.
Thanks, Eloise. When Roe versus Wade passed in 73, a lot of legal scholars, left and right, a lot of constitutional scholars felt that of all the cases that had come to the Supreme Court, not specifically just abortion, but including them, it was the one that was written in the weakest. It was one of the weakest decisions they had ever written. Where they tried to find an implied right to privacy in the Constitution, because the word abortion is always not in the Constitution, and health care is not necessarily in the Constitution. But there have been some interpretations into the Constitution and in the 14th Amendment about where does the right to privacy fit in. But how the justices at that time wrote it's an opinion, right? When they don't make a decision, they write in an opinion. And when they wrote their opinion, a lot of scholars thought that their justification was pretty sketchy, where they tried to fit it in under the privacy clauses that are within the Constitution. So they had a lot of scholars predicted then that eventually that a case would come where it could be overturned if the balance of the court shifted, which the balance of the court did, and it would take the right case to get to the Supreme Court level, because they don't accept. The Supreme Court gets hundreds of requests, but they only handle a couple of dozen a year, in their sessions. They don't really handle that many cases. So the timing for pro-life, advocates, the timing had to be right in terms of when it was working its way through the pipeline and what the composition of the Supreme Court would be. So the current court clearly viewed that the right to privacy, basically, that was implied by the previous court was invalid. That you couldn't find it in the text of the Constitution. And this is, when you're studying the Constitution, there are two ways that people view it, whether you're a scholar or not. There are those who are originalists, and those are people like Alito on the Supreme Court, who believe that the words written in the Constitution mean the same today as they were written back then. That the interpretation of the Constitution doesn't evolve over time. That's an originalist interpretation. And Alito was the main author of this opinion. The other interpretation is the one I just laid out, which is that the Constitution was never meant to be a static document, that it has to evolve and change over time, which is actually largely true from the standpoint that they built in a process to amend the Constitution, right? If the Constitution, the counter-argument is, if the Constitution was not meant to be one original document, then why did the framers create a path to amend it? And there have been 27 amendments. Now, it's difficult to amend the Constitution. It takes 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. So think about that. There is no way right now that 3/4 of the states are agreeing to anything. It's a 75%. It's not just Congress. 3/4 of the states have to agree to an amendment. And the last amendment that passed was, I think, the 27th Amendment, which is 1971, was basically the amendment that says that members of Congress cannot vote themselves a pay raise and have it take effect in the current term. Does that make sense? So in other words, they can vote themselves a pay raise, but they have to get reelected to get the benefit of the pay raise that they voted on. So it basically it incentivizes them to have to perform in their job. And that one, you would think that should have been in the Constitution from the beginning, but a lot of them were very selfish. So why give up their right to give themselves a pay raise? But now they have to get reelected to get that. But I said it comes down to the interpretation of privacy rights in the Constitution. It's the opinion that was released last week had less to do with when is a baby 6 weeks, 12 weeks, first semester. That was the other problem with the original. From reading about it, the other stumbling block for Roe versus Wade is that it defined a specific time period. I forget what the benchmark was, but even at the time, they realized that even people who are more left-leaning are eventually going to see that where that court ruled life begins was going to come, that science was going to bear out that life doesn't have, that it's not a baby at 20 weeks, that, when's viability and things like that. So it's tough, but it's been mandated back to the states. So it's a mess right now. Basically at the federal level, the Supreme Court has said this is not a federal matter because it's not in the Constitution. That's the other thing. People are saying now that what they did, they took it out of the Constitution. I don't know that that's actually a valid argument that abortion was in the Constitution. You could say it was implied through the right to privacy, but you're not going to find those words in the Constitution. But now by being thrown back to the states, it's a potpourri, right? It depends on where you live, and it's local laws. And I don't know. I'll be honest. It's going to get messier before it gets cleaner. It's going to get much messier. You already have, Arizona. Women are coming in from Arizona because that right's been taken away in Arizona, and we're the closest border. And that's the other part about it. Elliot, I don't want to be the male talking about legislating women's rights, because I just don't think it's my place to do that. I know where I stand on moral and spiritual principles, but it's not my body. And I don't want to answer any more questions about that.
What's so funny is I told my husband a few days ago, I said, oh, I got to deal with this. And he's like, you be really careful, Chris. That's like a hotbed. And we said, I don't know if this is the Sunday to do it. And he got stuck. Yeah, well, and the reality is,
I wouldn't do it.
yeah, I think the biggest thing, if I was going to say anything, is that there's people sitting in the pews that have had abortions. When not me, I haven't had one, but I will tell you, it's really easy to judge until, just like he was talking about manifest destiny and the idea of, context is everything. And I think that we need to be compassionate in our approach, and remember too that a lot of it comes down to it's a cultural thing. My son was dating somebody who was from France, and she had been raised in Europe. Even though her mom was American, she was raised in Europe, and she had a plan in her life, and he was saying, he thought maybe he was going to marry her, and he said, well, what would happen if you got pregnant early? And she said, oh, I would just terminate the pregnancy. And he was like, wait, what? No, that's my baby. You can't just do that. We would just have the baby and make it work, and you could still finish school and all of that. And she said, it's not a baby. She said, it's a baby when it's born. And it's really hard for us, especially as Christians, to understand that. But it's hard to... Sometimes I think we fight the wrong fight, in that we're trying to convince them when honestly it's a matter of, the Holy Spirit has to do that. And so I think, is it complex? You bet it is. Do I personally and morally and denominationally support our denomination in that, we believe in the right to life. We believe that, children are from conception on are God's creatures, absolutely. But how we go about it and being so careful not to, cheer and in our cheering condemn or add shame. Our job is to love and to support and show them the same compassion that Christ would. What did Christ say to the sinner, to the woman at the well? Who was having, affair after affair and, had been married, 5 times, and the one she was with, she wasn't living with. And what did he say? Let those who have no sin, cast the first stone. And one by one, the Pharisees, and these were the religious people, threw their stones down and walked away. And so I just think we need to be kind. We need to fight the fight. We need to continue to change and help people change. I'm just going to end this out really quick with our roles as Christians in our country. Jesus made it really clear. Mark 12:17, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. And then in 1 Peter 2:13 through 17, and then also in Romans 13, he talks about, for the Lord's sake, respect those in authority and submit to all human authority. And Eloise, you kind of alluded to that, that there's times that, whether you agree or not, there's some things that you need to submit to. Part of why we during COVID, or why I chose during COVID to shut down, every instinct in me was like, no, they're wrong, and I don't want to have to shut down, and da-da-da-da. But part of why I did it was because I felt like by not doing it, it would be sending a message to the community that we don't have to follow the rules. And there wasn't anything morally or ethically wrong with shutting down the church. We survived, and God honored that. We are, though, Christians first and patriots second. Our Christianity should always take precedent over our patriotism. There was an author that wrote a book, and I managed to delete his name, but I can get it for you if you want it. And it was a Christian author, and he was just talking about, how are we to balance our patriotism? We are blessed. We live in an incredible country. And I think that sometimes lately we get so caught up in politics and who's right and who's wrong that we forget the country we live in. And we should be grateful. We should be grateful for the things that we have. And, Acts 17:26, Paul says, from one man he made every nation, meaning the Lord made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And the Lord determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. It's not by accident that we're living in this time in history, and it's not by accident that we were born here and that we're living here now. So our job is, God has a purpose for us here. We are to be salt and light in the community. We are to be compassionate. We are to love people. And I'm going to read a quote from his book, and it says, God has blessed our nation, but America is not the chosen nation like Israel. Yes, we can love our nation, but we should not whitewash its past. Yes, we need to pursue just laws, but we also need, and this is the key, to win people's hearts and minds. Yes, we can appreciate a pluralistic public square, but all creation is under God's rule. Yes, we can display flags and sing patriotic songs in worship. But we should also be wary of our tendency to idolize these national symbols. It's not always wrong, like Eloise said, what Billy Graham's quote was, to protest when things are wrong. But we got to be careful that we don't idolize them. Let's pray. Father God, you have graced us with the privilege, Lord, of a country that, as we perhaps were reminded of today, that yes, was founded on godly principles, but maybe not always in the way that we would like to believe. And sometimes, God, I think we kind of romanticize, so to speak, our founding fathers. Now, does that mean that I am not grateful? That I'm not grateful for this Constitution that was woven together and is one of, around the world, it is known as a beacon, our Constitution. So God, we are grateful for this Independence Day, where out of it was born our Constitution, the beliefs that shaped America. But let us remember, Lord, that we are only here temporarily. And while America is an incredible country, it's not yours. God, we want your kingdom. We want to be kingdom-minded, recognizing that America isn't going to save us. You are. So God, we come before you. We thank you for who you are. We just ask that you continue to bless us. Help us to be shining lights. Help us to be salt and light in our communities and to love people. But also, Lord, to stand firmly, not on the truths of this land, but on the truths of your word. God, that's what we want. We want to stand on your firm foundation. You are our God. You are the one that rules. All creation is under you, Lord, and we are grateful for that. So thank you, Lord. Let us celebrate and just praise God that we were chosen to live in this country for such a time as this. So we love you. We just ask, God, that you continue to bring peace to our country. And God, help us as Christians to be the peacemakers. We love you, Jesus. And we pray all these things in your name. And everybody said, amen. Bernadette has been downstairs happily wrapping 100 and some odd hot dogs. We knew we were going to be low today, so everybody has to take at least 2 hot dogs with them, as well as some apple pie. And we also have sparklers, and they are real sparklers, but I do put up a disclaimer, don't light anyone on fire, because the church gave them out, so we would be considered liable probably. So God bless you. Stand up. Have a happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day. And thank you, guys. And the food is out to the left on the patio.